Atlas Pandemica, Maps to a Kinder World, is a project by the Stove Network designed to encourage pioneering approaches in charting the changes that have happened since the outbreak of COVID-19 locally, and tries to navigate the way forward into a more hopeful and shared future. In this series, Stove orchestrator Matt Baker speaks with the artists, writers and researchers involved in the project, offering an insight into the process and discoveries each have made. We hope you enjoy.
Welcome to Atlas Pandemica podcast number 8. I'm Matt Baker, and along with artist Robbie Coleman, I'm one of the curators of the project. Atlas Pandemica, Maps to a Kinder World, is a compendium of 10 projects led by creative people, each investigating a different theme highlighted by life during the COVID pandemic. Projects work directly with people in Dumfries and Galloway, focusing on the impacts and the learning from the community's experience of the evolving pandemic. Atlas Pandemica was conceived and is managed by community-led arts organisation, the Stove Network, and it explores local responses to the pandemic and how these might shape new approaches to our shared future. The project is supported by Scottish Government's Supporting Communities Fund. You can find more information about the project at atlaspandemica.org. In this series, I'll be talking to each of the artists leading one of the Atlas explorations. And today, it's an enormous pleasure to be joined by Peter Smith. Peter is a multidisciplinary artist who makes interactive art and wood-based sculptural forms. Peter's from Dumfries originally, and his work often attempts to refocus how we view the human relationship to nature and the world around us. Hello and welcome, Peter. How are you doing?
Hi, Matt. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Great to see you.
It's my first ever podcast.
Well, I'm getting used to it now. It's all right. You're going to be fine. Okay, let's go back to May 2020. Feels like a lifetime ago when Atlas Pandemica was getting started. What was happening for you during that first lockdown, and what prompted you to get involved in the project?
So my first lockdown, it was an interesting one. The first lockdown for me was kind of largely based on, I actually kind of like, it sounds quite like a hippie way to describe it, but I did kind of get a lot more connected to nature in that first lockdown, as there's a kind of an area of forest behind my house that had basically overgrown, and kind of we wanted to try and re-put some paths and things through it. So my first experience was very much I actually got outside and did a lot more kind of connecting back to this forest that I kind of grew up in my childhood around me. So I by no means had the worst lockdown experience in that, but it kind of, the like emotional kind of side of the lockdown really hit me in that one, and trying to process and deal with lots of like horrifying stories that you could hear, and I think particularly in this region that like there was a bit of a time delay, so you could hear like COVID cases are rising and they're jumping around, and it was like happening around the region before it hit us. And so there was this kind of strange kind of thing of knowing what was coming down the line for us. And I found that this kind of quite started quite like a kind of emotional process of kind of beginning to deal with ahead of it, kind of like, cool, so what are we looking at? How are we going to face that? That kind of was the state of mind, I guess, that I was in around the first lockdown. And so I think when kind of looking around, I was finding creativity hard. I had suddenly all of this time, but actually like sparking ideas of like, oh, I want to go do this and that. It was just some of the emotional side of it was overwhelming to this point that like the creativity wasn't flowing. But I also began to see some really amazing things happen, of community local like food projects really kicking in, lots of kind of mutual aid things happening in, and the kind of attitude of people around here that really began to go, no, we'll look after each other, we'll take care of each other, we will step up to support each other. I found that really also quite amazing, and I began to really extract from that lots of the formation ideas that came into play later down the line when looking what to make for this project.
Amazing. Okay, I mean, because I mean, thinking about the project, you took a very different approach to most of the other Atlas artists who, you know, rather than involving an artwork in response to research with the community, as most people did, you actually proposed an artwork itself as a means of doing that research. Can you describe the elements of your project, Beauty in the Broken, as it was called?
So yeah, Beauty in the Broken is very much, it's an interactive art project that you're right. The research side of it kind of happened during the project rather than taking research and making a visual element to it. It's probably always a bit of my creative process is to work inverse of how I should have done or work backwards. But yeah, it basically, I looked at creating a set of Zen gardens or rock gardens that would be placed throughout the town, and each of them would have a different gardener who maintained and looked after each garden through a period of weeks that we had them on site throughout the town. And the kind of research that was happening was kind of, how does small acts of creativity, how do they play out into helping us process a much larger like ever-changing set of information and stresses that come through living through a pandemic. So the elements, I guess, in that were, one, the garden, two, the gardeners, and then beyond that, there's the audience of the town that would walk past and be able to view each of the gardens each day. And in each of those different audience members, then you kind of begin to build a bigger picture of the kind of emotional way that we're processing a collective trauma.
Because I guess that processing would be, you'd be seeing that carried out through you, through the gardeners, through the people who were experiencing, because there was a new garden made every day. That's right. And each gardener got the same set of instructions, or how did that creative process work, or how did they make the garden?
Yeah, so every day I would send out the same coordinates on a grid to each of the gardeners, and they would then translate that by putting multiple objects in the garden, and then they could design any pattern they wanted around the same coordinates. So if you were to take a walk along each of the gardens, each one would be translating the same information very differently. And that could mean that I think the interesting thing rather is more that some artists would really carry the same themes in their pieces while having not looked at each other's work. So some days lots of stuff would be very like angular and sharp. Other days it would be very like curvy. But it was interesting that you would have a wide variety of different garden designs and shapes raked into the gravel. But there was often kind of a theme, like a very like really curvy one day, lots of circles and curves, or geometric, and then each of the artists would each of the gardeners would have made more geometric patterns. so there was a kind of interesting way to then see how people were translating a simple thing. But then I think the kind of interesting part of that for me was kind of seeing how the gardeners would respond to that. Kind of became a really interesting, fascinating result to me. So I was pretty much convinced that all the gardeners were going to get fed up at me within 10 days into the project. I'm bored of this. Why did I sign up to do this? What's going on? But instead, actually, we kind of kept finding what I'd hoped would happen was that it became a very kind of personal, reflective kind of moment within a day that would be just set aside to kind of doing something creative that could kind of occupy that part of someone's mind for a short period of time, but would be like a creative task that would just kind of be like, cool, that settled me for the today. I can go on, I can get on with everything else in my day. But that just taking that short period of time to be creative had really created a kind of a way to process lots of other things. Yeah.
Let's look at that processing bit in a bit more detail, because we had long conversations at the beginning of this project as you were evolving the idea about this idea of recovery and repair. I mean, repair was a particularly strong idea. Can you just say a bit more about that, about how what you were, how you were inserting gardens into the sort of fabric of people's lives as an idea of recovery and repair?
So I have like my own kind of journey of healing that's very much related to scars and to healing. So to put a bit of context, I have a big scar on my forehead that happened when I came off a bike on a London road. So it's quite a prominent visual scar, and it's taken me a while to process that really makes my face look different. But I also kind of started this journey of processing that to find a beauty in this thing that I initially don't like about myself. But instead, I kind of looked at this concept called Kintsugi. In Japanese culture, it's where you have some pottery and you repair broken pottery by filling it with like these gold seams. And all of a sudden that object is not just a broken object that you fixed, nor is it the original pot, but instead it's something new and something beautiful in its new state as a kintsugi object. And that kind of plays in its part in a much broader Japanese philosophy of Wabi Sabi, which every time you try and describe it, it does a little bit of disservice, but very broadly speaking, it's the beauty of imperfections. It's those things that are ever so slightly asymmetrical or imperfect, but they kind of create character about that individual piece. So for me, I kind of approached Atlas Pandemica with this kind of view of, we're going to come out of this with some scars, some hurt, some pain. But there is something that will be beautiful about what comes out the other side of this pandemic. And for me, I wanted to find ways to celebrate those moments of healing, the scars that are left. We don't need to hide them. In fact, they're part of who we now are in Dumfries. And that, I think, kind of drove me to this point of how do I kind of create these outdoor art installations that are interactive, that people can work with, that fits within all the social distancing restrictions, but starts a conversation about how we heal. And for me, that kind of took this form of giving most of the creative control over the visual side of it over to these other gardeners to explore that themselves.
It's such a lovely idea. I mean, that's the bit that I've really held on to of through your project, of the idea that healing work is the mindfulness of the tending the gardens is part of the healing. Then it's being done by the gardeners, but then sort of the gardeners are almost doing it for everybody else who's then passing by, and it's kind of this collective act towards that healing. I think that's such a beautiful idea, Peter.
I think one of the things that's really struck home over this last year is how it's really for whether it's a council or whether it's as an arts organization or in personal news, it's really great. It's really sexy to like throw out these big projects and plans. But actually, the thing that makes the biggest difference for communities is tending and maintaining. It is keeping the things that we have at a good level. And actually, that's kind of one of the things that I think can often go amiss when we talk about these things is that some of the most beautiful things that came out of the pandemic was neighbors caring for each other, or creating new ways to actually include people. The pandemic has actually brought accessibility to lots of people with like some disabilities or something, has actually brought them into art spaces that might be a barrier to entry otherwise. And it's that kind of like small little things have actually opened up some really beautiful new avenues. But if we don't mark them in some way, we could potentially lose them. And I think that those for me are some of those scars that actually become really beautiful gold seams.
You mentioned earlier the idea of social distancing, and I mean, last year was a sort of a series of frustrations in a way for the Beauty and the Broken project.
Yeah.
Trying to get on site, not being able to get on site. So I mean, the majority of the year for you was spent on your own, building gardens, finding gardeners, seeking permissions for the project. I mean, what was that like for you in terms of shaping your experience of the pandemic? We're all talking about community. You were in a shed on your own most of the time.
Yeah. No. So, I mean, I'm kind of used to working on my own in a shed. As one of my main streams of my creative practices, using a lathe and kind of wood turning, kind of sculptural forms, which, like, a lot of that time you do spend alone, and that sometimes is a part of being an artist. But even in that, I had like a housemate move in with me before the second main lockdown here, who offered to help, and that kind of was the strange part for me, was having someone keen to help. Because there was nothing else to do. But yeah, I think I learned a lot trying to apply for council site permissions and getting setbacks. And the strange thing is, it kind of worked out in, like, it felt very frustrating at the time to be like, okay, lockdown is tightening, no one should really be out of the house for long periods of time, let's push it back again. But one of the things that kind of opened up was actually the opportunity to have the project start on the same week that a year previously, we had gone into the first lockdown. So it actually lined up kind of in this really beautiful way to kind of mark 1 year of the pandemic hitting and affecting the town in a very very visceral way. And like, so the frustrations of it hitting different points and definitely kind of arose, but actually kind of created like a really beautiful moment to it. And I don't know, I designed the project so that it could expand if there was very few restrictions, and it could tighten up. But even within that, there was like no way to entirely predict what would happen. But also, like, it lined up to like spring hitting, and as the gardeners would tend each garden each day, more little buds would burst on trees, and this kind of new life arriving kind of worked really well to be able to view each garden each day and kind of feel things coming alive. Because the other part of the project was, once the gardens were constructed and moved onto site, I walked the path and the route of each of the gardens every day, to take pictures and to document, and to kind of also take my own personal practice of connecting with the town in a new way, which was fascinating. I walked down so many roads that I had just never really paid attention to before, and kind of enjoyed parts of the town that I hadn't had much of a personal connection to. I'd definitely like been to, but didn't have maybe memories attached to them, or really hadn't observed all that much of the surroundings, rather than just a kind of going somewhere, walking through that space. But I actually got to enjoy those spaces in a way that I hadn't done in a long time. And that was fascinating as well.
So tell us about those places. I mean, what were the places that you picked for the gardens, and why? What was the
so we ended up settling on 6 different locations. And I always go through them and get them in the wrong order or miss them. But so there's one at the train station, at Dumfries train station, one at the council building, the council headquarters, one at Ewart Library, one by the river at the boathouse and near Otterburn Gallery. The next one was then at Dumfries Museum, and then the final one was in the bandstand at the Dock Park. And each of those was kind of chosen for different reasons. We kind of wanted to try and find someone that had a connection to each location, either they lived close or worked close, but would have a kind of a connection to the space that kind of meant it would mean a bit more to them to be able to use that space. And the practical side of also trying, they had to carry rakes to these gardens every day and carry them away. But each of them kind of felt like a theme. So the train station was usually this like busy, bustling place full of commuters and a market and all sorts of things going on. But it really kind of, it was an almost eerie place to go during lockdown, just because there was trains coming through and few people getting on and off. But each of them, in the sense that they were related to patterns and rituals or habits, this commuting kind of side of it felt like a solid place to put it. And then the council buildings, what the council went through in the COVID, I guess the kind of trying to get a control on the situation of the council. Suddenly people weren't working in the council buildings, but they were also suddenly taking on mammoth tasks to try and coordinate a COVID response locally. However you feel about the local council, actually, like, that's made up of some individuals who have done amazing work over the last year. And it felt like a really good place to put a garden to mark that, and to kind of connect, I guess, like that central location to it. Your library is this one that I love, the your library building. It's fascinating, but I love libraries in this way that they have. They fill this one space in society where it's a place that you can go and you don't have to spend any money. You can just exist there. And that creates a really interesting connection that people have to libraries, in that, like, people regularly go and get books out and build this own little community around the library. And that was ripped away during that time. And like the Dumfries libraries actually had someone who hit the record for the most books ever borrowed from a library. And I found that amazing. So I really liked that as a location. The rowing club, I was kind of suckered in by that site because it's right by the river, and that the river is also like the heart of the town in many ways. And it's a location that people walked during the pandemic. So while the others had kind of been maybe these rituals before the pandemic, in many ways, that's the first site that was actually one that began to see this increased footfall during the pandemic, as people created this new ritual of walking each day to just get out the house, to do that, a lot of daily amount of exercise, which is a funny kind of phrase now. It's funny to think that that's such a thingy, like a strange thing a year ago. But yeah, so that location kind of increased its footfall. It became a new habit in that time. Dumfries Museum was the next one along that. And that, I guess, there's this kind of strong connection to the past that I felt was really powerful and really strong. And again, though I hadn't quite realized it when we put that on site, actually that had very much become a location where people had increased the footfall during the pandemic, because it's got one of the best views that you can see over the town. And yeah, I really love that building. The camera obscura is just beautiful. And then the bandstand was the final one, which it's such a weird, interesting little structure, this little bandstand in the Dock Park. But it had also become this little hub where you could kind of go and shelter and meet friends. So it had become a little hub of that during lockdown. I mean, I think it always has been, but increasingly so, is that it's a safe place that you could go outside, but maybe get a little bit of respite. I mean, I think teenagers have always known that, and it's always been like a good drinking in the park kind of location. So it was interesting. It was a nice place to mark that as well.
Yeah.
The bandstand's just a little weird character place.
And they together they made a really nice walk around the town. It was really nicely thought through. So I mean, did they, when you got them on site, did they feel the way that you'd expected them to? And how did people react? What was the public reaction like?
So that's the fun part of the story, I guess, that we get onto. So for me, it took months of making these things, working alone, and then getting them on site was amazing to just be like, there they are. These things are going to start functioning and running the way that I planned. And that's always really exciting to see. It kind of opens up a new chapter in the whole project story. The public reaction to them is really funny. Often to me, when they would see me, it would be really, really like, I got lots of beautiful stories of people that would use them in ways that I had hoped, but maybe not. So one thing that I noticed is by several ones by the rivers, those photographers would go and take pictures of the ducks and the swans. And I think there's a kingfisher down there from time to time that people were taking pictures of. And I got multiple conversations with them who are like, oh, this is what is this? This is unusual and weird. But then as I would be walking around, I'd bump into them later down the weeks of it being there. And they'd be like, oh, I went to see this one. I went to see this one. They would like start listing them out. And then all of a sudden, like this kind of different stories that conversations they had had. And there was one couple that had gotten some really bad news about a neighbor with a bad health diagnosis. And they then told me that they had purposely gone to walk the gardens to kind of get out the house, begin to process this information, and that the kind of effect of them had been helped it really calm them and process some really, quite devastating news. And that was amazing. That was really nice to hear that it had helped in any kind of way like that. But what's kind of fun about public art is that it can provoke some other reactions as well. And the kind of story that goes with this is that so one of the local newspapers is connected to the Daily Record, and the Daily Record then posted an article about the project on the local Facebook groups, which sparked a whole bunch of conversations, which weren't all positive comments. And I don't know, I'm trying not to find it really funny because, well, I mean, I can find it really funny, but to me, it's really funny that this like quite simple project kind of kicked up such a reaction from some people. So we got like comments of like, they look like cat litter trays. Like I heard lots of things like, well, I like arts and crafts, and I don't get this at all. And to me, that's great. Like, not everyone has to get it. And in fact, actually, it kind of kicked up some reactions. I like that, it's kind of fun to be the bad boy of public art locally, to make quite like a project that isn't really all that like abrasive, but still kind of kicks up a reaction. And to me, that like at first I was like, oh, maybe I need to really rethink what I've done. And then I just kind of found it increasingly funny and interesting that, it can kick up, like public art can kick up such a reaction. Became really like interesting to me after a while. I found it fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a cause celeb for a while, which is fantastic in terms of people knowing about it but how did that land with you? Because you'd found these, you put out a call for gardeners to get involved, and you'd kind of then nurtured these relationships with these folk to get them ready for this process, and then they'd been on site every day. So I mean, how did they cope with that exposure, and what was their experience of the whole thing like generally?
So I think in many ways it kind of just bonded the group. That actually, like, so we had a WhatsApp group going where one, I would post all the coordinates, but they could also share their images with each other and encourage each other. And that group was constantly full of like positivity of like, that looks beautiful, you've done a really great job, like patterns and designs today. And then it would also be like tips and tricks of like, use the rake this way. I found that it worked like that. So when we kind of began to get this public reaction on Facebook, my first instinct was kind of shield them from it and not necessarily tell them all about it. But then actually kind of being like opening it up to them, it kind of, what was really nice to see was each of those gardeners then got more passionate about the project, and kind of, I think it more solidified for them that it had actually been a really good experience, and that was really kind of, that was a nice side of it to see, because people trying to take away something that they had really found great meaning in kind of then created more meaning, or kind of solidified that meaning for them. the thing is, for as well, what like I saw all the comments coming up of like some reaction, a lot of reaction to like what money had been spent on this or anything, and there was a kind of gut reaction of like disappointment. And then I found it funny, and then I was like, actually, I needed to stop looking at these because these comments are not necessarily healthy for me to keep looking at. And then like a few days later, I was like, okay, I'll go and scroll through these and see. And what was more beautiful to see was that lots of other people had countered all of those. Some people I knew, but a lot of people I didn't know, telling their story of how they had connected with these gardens across the town. And actually some really nice comments and beautiful kind of thoughts and stories came out of that were more uplifting and kind of helped the gardeners also feel like this had actually made a positive impact in a lot of people's lives. And then I think the other kind of effect of that is when people saw me walking the gardens with a camera, taking pictures, they would come up and talk and people would be like, oh, I saw the comments, I love it. And then I would get more kind of personal stories from those people of how the gardens had become a new pattern, a new routine for them of like walking through, maybe not all of them, but a couple of ones close to them had kind of been a reason or an excuse to get out the house to go do something. And that's now become like this thing that I'm really fascinated about as like good excuses, like trying to create an opportunity that for some reason I think it's a very human thing to do, is that we won't let ourselves do something that we know would be good. We need an excuse as a reason to go and do something. And these gardens being time limited, only lasting for like a week more or whatever, means that like I know I need to go for a walk, but I need an excuse to go for a walk. And so all of a sudden these kind of things began to work together. And then like I got an email on one of the final days of the project of somebody who had seen the comments, I presume, and gone around them on their daily commute to work. And I'll actually just get like I don't know if I can find the email about it, but basically this person had said to me something along the lines of, I'm not interested in creative arts things usually, but I find myself staring at these increasingly each day that I went past. And the words he said were something really funny. It was like, you've taken this crusty old man and made him appreciate something really gentle. Mm. And to me, that made the whole project worth something, is if you can kind of find yourself resistant to something, but beginning to appreciate something small and gentle. That's beautiful to me. That's amazing.
It is. Yeah, those wee things are what makes it worthwhile. It's fantastic. And have you spoken to the gardeners much after like how's the whole, the process of being involved in the whole thing? How's that been for them?
So all of them had a different experience, but all have really enjoyed it. Now it's been like a week or two past since we took the gardens off site, and I'm about to actually, that's the kind of future part of this project, is I'm doing some kind of follow-up conversations with people and then adding that to making a short film about the project. And for different gardeners, it has kind of meant different things. And it's kind of, I guess, as the project ended, then lockdown began to unlock at the same time. So for some of them, I think if it's just marked that time as actually being a better time than lockdown could have been, that's been one experience that has just been a kind of nice result. I think the thing is with these projects is that this project is everything about it. Like gentle is the kind of word that seems to click with me about it. It's never going to be one that has like this huge, big impact, but actually it's lots of small, gentle impacts that has brightened someone's day or given focus to someone's day. That the project was always kind of about these simple patterns and rituals that help improve stuff. And that, I personally believe that small bits of creativity, it doesn't have to be a Zen garden or a rock garden. It can be, I've got one friend who's just done a sketch, a drawing every day, going back months now. And that has always kind of been topical or on something that he finds particularly fascinating and interesting. But it's that small act of creativity kind of sparks a kind of way to sustain yourself through a hard time. I think part of it is because it engages your mind on something that isn't just consumed by the everyday concerns and worries, but instead you're kind of taking a moment out to be thoughtful about something else. Helps you then process all these other things because you're not tunnel visioned on the single thing that's like. So for me in that first lockdown, it was this constant barrage of horrendous news and stories, but actually getting to like tunnel visioned on that kind of then eats away at you a bit. It's not great. But create small little creative tasks that have no pressure. They have no consequence. It's not like you're working on a creative brief for a client that has to be in by this time, but instead a little like, oh, I just made this thing just to enjoy the process of making it. That to me was kind of what the gardens were about.
Effectively, you're talking about mental health there, really, aren't you? Huge, big interventions are not what mental health needs. It is those tiny little bits that just give you a bit of a lift or change your focus or allow you to see things in a different way that are an integral part of mental health. So I think I think what you've done there is really important in showing the importance of those small gentle acts.
Yeah, I like. Yes, mental health are like trying to bring conversation about mental health struggles and what can create good mental health was definitely like something I wanted to focus on, but not necessarily be like, this is a project about mental health, because it can often
that brings a stigma with it. Which is not useful.
It can often flare up problems.
We all have mental health. It's about health. It's not about illness. It's about health. Yeah.
Exactly. And I went through a good couple of years of really struggling with poor mental health a few years ago. And there's a really, I can't remember who it is that said it now, but they were like, we need to stop talking about mental health. and I think there's action needed on that. And sometimes that can feel like as when you're going through mental health problems, sometimes you're just like, I need this big thing to intervene and help and fix this. And it feels hopeless because it can be out of your control. But, the reality of what you can take on at that time can be these smaller things. And it's those smaller things that allow you that kind of in small interventions that you create. I mean, I guess it's a little bit like, I don't know, like a small hole in a fabric cloth, if you can, it just takes a small one and then a little bit, and you can then broaden the whole thing out and you can cause a whole tear. And in some ways that kind of breaking through mental health barriers for me was kind of the thing that I found when I was in that hardest point was I turned to wood turning and I started really embracing this small creative practice where I could just go into the garage and on a freezing winter night make something and come inside and be like, I made this thing, took this really ugly piece of wood, I made it into something that is now nice. And that really helped me through my, and it's not like the cure-all, but it created an opportunity. It created that little pinhole that I could begin to kind of work my way out. And I think it's lots of those small things adding together. And so when making this project, that was definitely a part of my thinking, but I didn't want to label it a big mental health project because I don't know actually why. It's probably an interesting kind of thing. I guess that it was definitely there, but
it's maybe a bit like your the fella who emailed you and said, but I'm not somebody that likes art or craft, and you know, you've brought me around to something. It's like, you know, you've engaged with something without necessarily pointing at it and saying you need to be into this to get to it. I mean, I think that's often the smartest kind of art strategy is you know, to take you somewhere where you weren't expecting to be going, basically, by but rather than signaling this is what this is about and you're going to get this.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so I think you're an amazing advert for that kind of practice. I mean, you might be the bad boy now of public art, which is a great title. Hold on to that, Peter. You need
yeah, I will do. I'm going to start putting it in my bio.
Peter, that's just been an absolute delight talking through that. It's brought all of that project back, flooding back for me, and there's been some lovely moments through the whole thing. And thank you for all that you've done for the project. You've been a great part of Atlas Pandemica.
No worries. Thanks. It's it's a real journey, but like a real honor to do it. And it's been it's been one that, like, I guess I was creating this project as like the gardeners in mind and the audience in mind. And the one that I kind of forgot is there's part of that is me. I've been on this journey as well. And, you know, like it was great to have a focus on something during a kind of chaotic time where it felt like time wouldn't pass, but instead this kind of really gave me something to focus on and work on. And like, it sounds horrible to say, but I enjoyed that lockdown, the second major lockdown we had, because I had this project going on. So I recognize that that's like quite a privileged position to be in, but it did make this time.
Yeah, and I've really memorable. I've really seen you grow as an artist through this, particularly when the work was on site. I think the way that you handled yourself and the public and the gardeners, I think was absolutely exemplary. I think you did an amazing job.
Thank you.
Well done. And so you can find out more about Peter's work and all the Atlas Pandemica artists, including the rest of the podcast series, at atlaspandemica.org. And please tune in again next week for our next podcast with public artist Katie Anderson of the Elsewhere project in Atlas Pandemica. So thanks again, Peter.
No, cheers. Thank you, Matt.